Hello everybody, we are back, and we got the book, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. This time I've read much more than I did on our first take. You know what? Pretty considerable chunk out of the entirety of the book there, just on this fine evening. And I made some notes in the space where you'd really have like footnotes or something like that in other books this time. And I think I'm just going to start by sort of reading my thoughts that I wrote as I was reading the novel itself. And then I'll sort of explain further from there. Listening to the moment your thoughts relate to your actions real time until you reach the thought that if you had the right thought, even just about yourself, you could change everything, making thought count. Now all you can think about are thoughts. Watching the writer think this, we are told to keep thinking the entire time, as we see the author thinking, making breaks seem dynamic and fluid, until we either go along with our thoughts or think that at this point, that thoughts are then as out of control as any notion of power. So we accept these thoughts in being no worse for wear than our own thoughts, by a manner of how well we think the thinker manages the power of thought, so that thought itself still has a chance in their thinking. What means the more it is, the more we would think it's not just a thought, by the mastery of the one thinking, to not lose their thought. And that's sort of the feeling that I was getting from this book as it sort of progressed. I know that I had a unique description of it, and I tried to keep reading this time instead of sort of pausing like I did in my last episode. But I just wanted to give a real genuine impression of the first part, and more so the nature of what it's like to come across this book for the first time. And so I sort of cut everything short in my first video on this, but today I tried to really read at least a considerable amount to come to some conclusions. And that's basically how it reads. I have a few lines that I thought were worth mentioning in here, because it sort of gives you a point from which you can sort of understand how the tone of everything else reads, just by sort of how close all of these thoughts come to just being like an ultimate thought, or like the climax, the ultimatum of everything. So the more I seek to return to the zero moment from which I set out, the further I move away from it, the while my actions are bent on erasing the consequences of previous actions. And though I manage to achieve appreciable results in this erasure, enough to open my heart to hopes of immediate relief, I must, however, bear in mind that my every move to erase previous events provokes a rain of new events, which complicate the situation worse than before, and which I will then, in their turn, have to try to erase. See, it's almost like that could be just like some life philosophy right there at that moment, but the entire thing reads like that. There is no break. That's why I said it's like reading a break. And I related it to actually just like that moment where maybe you're doing something and your mind actually sort of clicks in sync with your actions, and you're thinking about what you're doing while you're doing it, because you realize that this is important. Do our actions follow our thoughts? Which means ultimately, is everything just thought? Or do our thoughts follow our actions? Or obviously, is there some more nuanced way between all the intricacies and manners of reality? And here's another part that I thought was important, or at least I thought would be good to read for an example of how this reads. Everything they say is the continuation of things they already said. It's just like, it's a statement that's just like, you should know. It's like an assumption. The author here is assuming that we almost think like this, but it's funny when you read, you can almost sort of just go along with things you don't even understand. But the fact is that maybe that you can't put words together like that. When you read something and totally commit to it, you are thinking in that way. And so I just think that that's a really fun thing to point out when I'm just sort of pointing that out right there. And then I go on more. This is the beginning of chapter 2. You can see I have all my notes right here in the bottom. He addresses the reader again, because at this time we've had like 2 stories, stories of the author, and we're about to be introduced into another mishap of this story. And then, funny enough, it's not going to be sort of like a play on all these things. It's trying to realize the full potential of the world in terms of actual connection itself, where the person in the novel is then going to take all of these experiences of everything being kind of broken apart, and they're trying to make a connection with somebody else who has experienced the same thing. But ultimately, maybe this is sort of a lesson on that idea of connection, and just this idea of, you know, maybe being lost, we can truly be found, because in that moment we can accept anything. And I think maybe the more that we can accept anything, the closer we can get to living in the moment, which is probably the truest not lost moment you can have. And some of his other books kind of navigate quandaries like that. You know, his one with Marco Polo and The Great Khan sort of do this play on, do 2 things ever really connect in this world, you know? But here are my notes for this second chapter. It goes, should I be thinking these things? Because he's bringing up, you know, by now you might be thinking. He's like writing that, addressing you, the reader, about what he's written so far. Should I be thinking these things? If a thought is fluid and confident, is this just a spell, or is it real time? There are many waterways, which all have a portion of life. Some even sweep you away on their banks. There is the question of, does water matter? Then there is the question of, at what point does a certain water matter most? It would be hard to tell, but in thought it does sound reasonable that there would exist a point like that. Does this tell us that the story is over? The total summed? Then perhaps water isn't real. It is a passage into eternity. Is this a confident and fluid thought? But what doesn't have an end? If it exists now, surely it exists forever. But the idea of the most important forever moves things to an end. So that's sort of my attempt to break and sort of change my personality on the spot, almost, from being something that is expressive to being something that is reasonable. And so I'm sort of displaying in a lot of ways during that section where I write in the footnotes what the author is doing here, and his ability to sort of cut or maybe go up a step or change an octave kind of thing and narrate something while sort of doing something at the same time, which is to almost make light of everything. You know, it's to emphasize this idea of change and of the idea of witness. And I think that the more we understand this idea of witness, that there's always something outside of our own experience to witness. And so the more that you sort of play this idea, you're basically just sort of unconsciously, you know, having some sort of Sigmund Freudian profession of God, where there's this third witness, or you know what I mean, this perspective, third person perspective always at play, sort of always being outside of whatever experience there is. And we can recognize this and sort of at least catch glimpses of it in our ability to change directions, change speeds, change tones, and ultimately in the end still recognize everything that we've done. So there you have it. There is my second sort of videography of Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Ciao.